Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. This is for those who believe that libertarian anarchism is a ridiculous, nonsensical, utopian pipe dream that's never going to be achieved. I'm curious whether or not this person would say that they support murder or not. Because, I mean, if you're against murder, I mean, what do you think? We're going to live in a world without murder? Well, no, you can still embrace the principle, even without knowing that all billions of people will never engage in it. You still stand on the principle that whether or not a murderless world will ever be achieved, well, you still are in principle against acts of murder, unjustly taking the life of another person. Do you support slavery? I would ask this person, do you support forced labor? What? You think we're going to live in a world where no one in the world ever forces anyone to do anything against their will? You're a utopian, ridiculous, nonsensical person who should not be part of the debate. Well, the same thing applies for rape as well. But we're never going to live in a world without rape, so why be against rape? Well, the same logic applies. We're never going to live in a world without government. Okay, Mr. Psychic, who knows what billions of people will do hundreds of years from now. I'm still going to stand on the ground of the non-aggression principle as the only morally justified way of people functioning in society. The same thing applies to theft. So how is it that they can have all these principles? They're against slavery, murder, rape, theft, assault. But when we say we support the non-aggression principle and don't believe the state should be held to any separate standards, we're called utopian, ridiculous, far-out thinkers who are totally extreme and out of the ordinary, when in reality, to be an anarchist only means that you believe that aggression is not justified and that states necessarily employ aggression, and therefore that states and the aggression they necessarily employ are unjustified. It's just an ethical view, just as anti-murder, anti-theft, anti-rape, anti-assault, anti-slavery. We just take these things to their logical conclusion. Accordingly, anyone who is not an anarchist must maintain either aggression is justified or B, states, in particular minimal states, do not necessarily employ aggression.
That, right? When someone says, well, there's been no working anarchy, blah, 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 blah. I mean, first of all, that's sort of ridiculous insofar as even if there was no such thing as anarchy that had ever been proven to be stable in the past, so what? So what? I mean, how ridiculously conservative can you be and say, well, until it's proven, I'm not going to believe it. Until it's proven, I'm not going to believe it, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, if that was the case, we'd still be in the caves, right? Every single advance, whether it is in ethics or in knowledge or technology or sociology or whatever, any sort of advance it has an untested aspect to it. I mean, this obviously is not somebody who's ever had any exposure to or interaction with venture capitalists. They're all about you for this huge value in, and the more unproven it is, the more value there is potentially in it. Right? So even if is somebody going to say, well, you can't show me, as in the sort of 17th century, you can't show me a society that has ever gotten rid of slavery, so getting rid of slavery is, you should never think that it's a good thing. Like, you should never assume that it's a good thing. And so that's just not, that's not true at all. That's a valid approach. So even if there was no such thing historically as or in the sort of present situation as anarchy that was stable and worked, then it would not be a valid objection. However, of course, there are, multi-hundred-year examples of societies that existed without governments, such as Iceland and shorter periods of time in Pennsylvania and so on. And so tons of examples of societies that have existed without a government. And of course, I would say that this gentleman, in his own life, he exists without a government. But even more fundamentally, there are lots of other examples about how a lack of centralized coercion, instead of breeding instability, breeds stability. So, for instance, in the realm of price, we all know that socialist calculation, as proven by von Mises, is an impossible situation. You can never have a central planner who is ever able to validly allocate the prices for things, because without a free market, there's no way of knowing localized requirements and general consumer demand for products. Price is an enormous computer printout of need and desire. And So the problem with socialist calculation, of course, is that you can never get a central planner who's able to create any kind of stability. Whenever you have central planning, extraordinary losses, starvations, lineups, hungers, incredible instability results. And so there's an example where government produces vast amounts of instability. And in the free market, there is no central agency for setting price. Right? The only thing that sets price is the aggregation of each individual's demand, and of course, willingness to actually part with money to get a particular good. And we find that prices turn out to be remarkably stable overall. And I'm talking about sort of in the prior to the introduction of centralized coercive control and privatized control of currency, right? So, a loaf of bread cost about the same in 1900 as it cost in 1800. Although, of course, standard of living had gone up considerably because wages had, tripled. But, there's an example of an extraordinary amount of stability coming out of a free market, more or less a free market approach to the question of price. And so from that standpoint, it's important to understand that a lack of centralized coercion does breed extraordinary stability, right? So if you remember what cell phones were like early on, you could barely get a signal without standing with tinfoil wrapped around your head, pointing your phone directly at the satellite and tracking as it went past, making sure there were no trees in the way. And there's been no centralized coercion saying, now all of these cell phone companies, they have to offer all of these cross-marketing, cross-promotional benefits so that they each charge each other and give you service just about anywhere in the world where there is cell phone service. Nobody's given them any directive to, but of course your cell phone service has stabilized enormously since this sort of stuff was introduced. So there's another example of how a lack of centralized coercion breeds an extraordinary kind of stability. And you could sort of go on and on about this kind of stuff, right? I mean, that there were no agencies that regulated the widths of railroad tracks, yet every railroad manufacturer on any given continent always worked with the same width, right? There was no one that said, well, they have to be, 2 feet apart, and it has to be regulated that way. It never happened, right? But you get this extraordinary stability, right? No one says that everyone has to handle TCP/IP packets in the same way. But all ISPs and now networks do handle them in the same way because, of course, the price of deviating from a standard that everyone else accepts, even in the absence of central regulation, is far too costly.
The fallacy of non-anticipation consists of supposing that everything worth doing or saying has already been done or said. Any new idea is rejected on the grounds that, if it were any good, it would already be part of current wisdom. Proposals are rejected because they have not been anticipated. If tobacco is really so harmful, how come people didn't ban it years ago? They didn't know. Nowadays, more people live long enough to experience the adverse effects, and we now have more techniques for measuring such things. The central assumption of the fallacy is unwarranted. Progress is made on several fronts, including the scientific and the social. New ideas are constantly being adopted, and there is no justification for supposing that our ancestors would have found them all. The presumption that they did intrudes irrelevant material into the argument. Wise though the sages of old probably were, we can no more presume in them the totality of wisdom than we can assume complete stupidity. If breakfast television is all that good, why has it taken so long for it to appear? Because we didn't realize that people wanted even more pap with their morning milk. It is not just products and processes which are revolutionized by invention. The same is true of changes in our living patterns. People didn't need these long Christmas holiday years ago. Why should they now? They probably did need them years ago. They just couldn't afford them. The same fallacy would have supported, and no doubt did, the continuance of child labor in mines and factories. The fallacy of non-anticipation is a great comfort to those who, while possessing a conservative disposition, cannot actually think of any arguments against the changes which are put forward. Mr. Chairman, this proposal has been kicked around for more than 20 years. If there were any merit to the idea at all, it would have been implemented long before now. The beauty of this is that your current rejection will serve as extra evidence against it in the future. Perhaps the reasons for past rejection were equally frivolous. To give added effect to the fallacy, you can enumerate some of the phantom legions who could have taken up the idea but did not. Their numbers appear to be ranged against the idea, like yourself, even though they might simply never have thought of it. Are we to assume that we are cleverer than the thousands of the very learned and competent people over the years who could have acted on a proposal such as this, but wisely refrained from doing so, any more than Beethoven was cleverer than the millions who could have written his symphonies, but did not do so? You will find the fallacy extraordinarily useful in resisting trends towards emancipation. After all, if there were any merit in having women and children participate in decisions, would it not have been discovered long ago? The same approach will help you to stand up against independent holidays, dining out, taking exercise, or eating courgettes. If there were any connection between drinking 8 pints of beer a day and obesity, don't you think that countless beer drinkers would have seen it by now? Why should they? They can't even see their toes.